Climate change has become one of the challenges of present time, with various efforts to find solutions aimed at reducing its effect on the environment. In Nigeria, the building sector is taking this challenge serious, with the Green Building Council of Nigeria leading the transformation of the built environment to create buildings and communities that are environmentally responsible, profitable, and healthy. This is our focus on Nigeria today. Thanks for joining us. I am Ikaria Clinton. Joining us for the discussion is Danjuma Waniko. He's the President, Green Building Council of Nigeria. Welcome to Nigeria today. Thank you, madam, and thank you for having me here. I must say, Green Building Council of Nigeria, sound a little bit new. So tell us what is it all about? What do you do, and what are your main goals? Okay, Green Building Council Nigeria is we're a non-governmental organization. It's important to say that first off. Our focus, as the name implies, is to promote green building practice and sustainable urban development in Nigeria. We have three broad areas we look at. We call them our strategic imperatives. These are net zero carbon, of course, which is linked to the climate crisis that you just mentioned in your opening remarks. We want to drive our buildings towards net zero, that is to be carbon neutral. The second area we look at is resource circularity, that is the circular economy, to make our building sector, construction more efficient, to use less resources, and to reduce waste. The third area which we look at, our third strategic imperative, is climate resilience, of course. That is to have our buildings and our cities resilient to the impacts of climate change. So we walk through, we try and achieve this using 4 different methods. One is advocacy, of course. We go out with our bullhorn, our trumpets, and we talk about it to government, to the public, to professional sector, to stakeholders. So advocacy and communications, very important part of our work. We also do education because people need to understand what it's about. So we run workshops, we run seminars, we run summits to educate professionals and the public on this thing we're doing, on this net zero, on resource circularity, and on resilience. We also try to promote certification of buildings, green building certifications like the EDGE standard, like LEED, to make the built environment greener. And the fourth strategy we use to achieve our aims is development and implementation of standards. That is the standards that drive the certification. So basically that's what Green Building Council is about. We have several projects we run, like summits. I mentioned summits, Future City Summits. We just had the last one in July this year. We had that together with the Africa Green Building Summit. In fact, we had 13 African countries with us in Lagos over a period of 3 days. For that summit, we also have a local green building rating tool we're developing, and then very important, the NDC scorecard project, which is one of the things we're going to be talking about today. Okay, now, before we talk about the NDC scorecard project, now, why is buildings, because you talk about green buildings, why is building important, in addressing climate change? How does it relate to Nigeria? Okay, very good question. Why are buildings important? There are 2 reasons I can give. One, of course, is there are two tracks on the climate change issue. One is mitigation, that is to reduce climate change. What causes climate change? Greenhouse gas emissions. Now, from research and science, we've come to understand that buildings and the built environment is one of the largest contributors
to climate change. It's responsible for about 40% of all greenhouse gas emissions. That's globally, not just looking at Nigeria. So the built environment is important in that context, that because it is such a large contributor, then it implies that it is also a large part of the solution to the climate crisis. That if we can address this 40% of greenhouse gas emissions that come from the built environment, then we go a long way to meeting our climate mitigation targets. The second one, which is equally important, is related to surviving or weathering climate change impacts, which is resilience. So we have mitigation, but we also have resilience, because climate change is here, as they say. It's not, yes, we're still trying to reduce it, but the one that has already happened, we have to live through it. And so we need buildings that can help us weather the impacts of climate change. Buildings that, in the midst of heat waves, we had a terrible heat wave last year in Nigeria. It's a bit better this year, but we expect this to continue and possibly even get worse. So how do you have buildings that can remain comfortable and habitable in the midst? How do you have buildings that can withstand repeated flooding? We just had a major crisis in Borno in the northeast. Buildings have been submerged in water. This thing happens year after year, and it affects the structure. It's not just the property in the building, but the building structure itself is affected. So how do you have buildings that can suffer this kind of experience repeatedly and still retain their integrity and be habitable? So these are the two reasons that buildings are important in the context of climate change: mitigation and resilience.
Okay.
Thank you.
In other words, how can the building, after suffering the effects of climate change, still stand?
Still stand. So you don't have to go and build a new house.
Okay.
You know, you move, well, you flood, and then, okay, you move back in and it's still habitable.
Oh. Now, back to what you mentioned earlier, the NDC, the Nigeria's National Determined Contribution. What exactly are they? Because this term is, really new to quite a lot of us.
Yes.
What are they, and what do they really aim to achieve?
Okay, so NDC, Nationally Determined Contribution. To answer that, I have to give a small history lesson. Okay, it traces back to the Paris Agreement 2015, when the countries of the world came together and agreed on this Paris Agreement in 2015. Part of that agreement was, how do I illustrate it? Okay, I think the best illustration is, let's assume you have a sick relative, which is like the earth we have. Okay, it's not well. We come together as a family and say, how this man or this woman needs X naira to treat this disease. As a family, we now come together and say, okay, we need 20 million, we need 50 million, and we say, okay, you, what can you give? You, what can you give? One may be a senator, one may be a minister, one may be a laborer, one may be a taxi driver. So you come together and say, we've come together as a family, and these are our contributions. So that is what the Paris Agreement is actually about. It says, countries, we've agreed that we want to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. To do that, we have to cut our greenhouse gas emissions. Now, each country, what can you contribute to this cut? How much can you reduce your greenhouse gas emissions? So this is what an NDC is. So Nigeria, as a signatory to the Paris Agreement, now came up with its NDC. I think they first submitted it in 2015 and updated it in 2021 and said, look, okay, Nigeria as a country, we're going to cut 20% of our carbon dioxide, our greenhouse gas emissions. So that is what our NDC is about. Okay,
so how does NDC now relate to the green building, or everything about, you just mentioned earlier about the green building and what they're doing. So how does it relate?
Yes. So the NDC is looking at, for example, Nigeria's NDC is looking at Nigeria as a whole. But in looking at Nigeria as a whole, The developers of the NDC, at the time it was prepared, it was Federal Ministry of Environment, but after we enacted our Climate Change Act in 2021 and set up the National Council on Climate Change, they are now the coordinating and implementing agency. So what they do is they have a national aggregate, but that aggregate is taken from the different sectors of the economy. So under our NDC, there are measures and there are policies that are related to buildings and cities, so that the buildings and cities will play their own role in making up that our 20% contribution. For example, maybe by making buildings more energy efficient, by increasing the use of renewable energy like solar, like wind, and things like that. So that is how buildings relate. So we have the NDC, it looks at various sectors, it looks at transport, looks at manufacturing, it looks at agriculture, you know, and including buildings. So that's how buildings fit into it.
Okay, we'll take a short break now, and the conversation will continue after the break. Don't go away.
The implementation of the ruling is also dependent on another aspect or another arm of government.
Nowhere in the world will allow under digital economy for banks not to be dispensing domestic currency in that economy.
What will make this one different? We want to know what they do as occupation. All of these are attributes that are questions have been designed to investigate.
In a few days to come, you see that we are all around their own crannies and everywhere in Nigeria, telling people to cooperate.
Welcome to Nigeria Today. Welcome back. In case you're just joining us, this is Nigeria Today. We're looking at addressing climate change through green buildings. And we have a gentleman here in the studio to take us through that. Yeah. Now, you know, the first workshop for the Nationally Determined Contribution Scorecard Project, the NDC Scorecard Project, had just been concluded. Now, before I ask, you know, what are the key takeaways and all of that, now, why does this project matter to Nigeria, and how does it fit into the Nigeria's climate goal, and of course the global efforts?
Okay, why it matters is how do I put this now? The NDC Scorecard Project is a project that what we're doing is we're trying to develop a tool that will allow Nigeria, it's not just Nigeria actually, it's a global initiative. Nigeria is one of 5 countries where this project is running. It includes the Philippines, Colombia, Brazil, and Egypt. So it's a global project, and each of us, we are now looking at our NDCs and our building related policies and using them to develop what we call a scorecard. What is a scorecard? The scorecard is now a list of measures or policies or initiatives that represent what we call best practice. What is the ideal? What should be in an NDC? What should be in your building codes or your land use policies? So we have that as a kind of a checklist, and it now allows our policy makers and our industry players to now look at this checklist and say, okay, this is good practice. Do I have this in place? If I don't have this, how do I put it in place? So it's kind of like a mirror that we look into, and you check your reflection and you say, okay, this looks right, this doesn't look right, this needs adjustment. Thank you. Okay,
now back to the workshop I just concluded. What were the key takeaways of this workshop?
Yes, we just had the workshop on Wednesday, just a couple of days ago. So that was actually just the start of this journey. The project is actually a month-long project. It's about 9 months. It's running from now till September August, September next year, and we're going to be running a series of 7 workshops. So this was just the start of the journey. What we did here to start off was simply to map our policy. We called it mapping, policy mapping and co-creation. So what we did 2 things. We looked at our NDCs, we looked at our local policies, and we extracted from them the measures and the initiatives that are relevant to buildings. Okay, and then we now took another look and said, okay, where are the gaps? Where do we need, what is missing? And we tried to fill in those gaps, and we came up with policy proposals or measures that would address those gaps. So that's what we did over a period of about 6 hours. We had a broad range of stakeholders there. We had people from the NCCC, the National Climate Change Council. We had Environment Ministry there. We had Power, Housing. We had, because of the relevance of the subnational sector, we also had representatives from subnational units. We had Lagos there. We had Abia. We had Kano. We had FCTA there. So it was, and we also had the private sector. We had real estate. We had finance. So many different actors and international agencies were also represented. Sustainable Energy for All, GIZ was there, so it and our professional bodies. So we brought these stakeholders together, and we sat over 6 hours in intensive session to look at this thing and then to co-create what we said is our a draft local scorecard.
Okay, now you talked about what is missing. I really want you to explain to us. So what are the areas we're having lacunas in our country? Okay, why you're still thinking about that? Let's talk about
I don't want to bias the result, okay, because I may have my own idea of what is missing, okay, may not gel with what the broader community thinks, but I can share my perspective, okay, if you wish. But I think there are gaps. We all understood. We were all there, and we all agree that there were areas that could do with strengthening. One of the things that I think we need to look at as a country is our policies tend to be focused on new buildings, new construction. Okay, that is very important because with our rapid population growth and our rapid growth of our cities, by 2050 thereabouts, I think we'll be going from about 50% urbanized to 70% urbanized, and it's likely that our built environment is going to double. So new construction is very important. But then we have the buildings that are already standing. Do we have policies to address their energy use? Do we have policies to address their resilience? Because these are the ones that are suffering climate change impacts now. These are the ones that are not quite fit for purpose to help the occupants survive a heat wave. So I think this is one of the areas that if I were personally to say, we will need to look at retrofitting our existing building stock to improve its energy efficiency and to improve its climate resilience.
Thank you very much for that. Now, you've mentioned quite a lot of players that are working together to ensure that we have, you know, a good roadmap to, you know, a better built environment. Of course, talking about the green building and all of that. Now, what about the role of the subnationals? Why is it important for them to be, you know, part of this?
It is. I would say it is critical. Why? You say because Nigeria is a federal country. There are certain responsibilities and obligations that are domiciled at the federal level, but there are also some responsibilities that are domiciled with the subnationals, with the states. There are 3 key responsibilities related to building that the states are responsible for. One is building regulation. When you want to build, your planning approval is done by a state agency. You don't come to Federal Ministry of Housing to get your building approved. They set and design the regulations for building. Land use policy, land use is under the states also, an environmental policy. So it would not be very helpful for us to sit at the national level and discuss and develop these things without engaging them, because whatever we do has to be practical, it has to be realistic, it has to be relevant to their contexts, and it has to recognize that Nigeria is a very diverse country. So if you do something without their view, for example, the weather in Dutse, for example, is very different from the weather in Port Harcourt or Lagos. So the needs of a building vis-a-vis climate resilience in Dutse, vis-a-vis climate resilience in Lagos, vis-a-vis climate resilience in River State are different. So this is why it's important that the subnationals are in the room with us, so that when we're discussing, they bring their local perspectives, their local context, their local climatic, social, and economic experiences into the conversation, so that the tool that we develop is applicable and relevant all over the country.
Okay, now talking about the Green Building Council, you've had your first workshop now, so what's the next step?
Next step is we've had the first workshop, so we've taken the feedback from the stakeholders. We are now going back to the office and we're going to now look at it, filter it, and put it together to come up with a result. Concurrently with that, because we couldn't have every stakeholder in the room, we're also going to be reaching out to those that were not in the room, and even those that were in the room who may have said, oh, I forgot to say this, I didn't share this. We're going to be reaching. So the conversation is going to continue on this policy mapping and co-creation. We also only had 5 subnationals in the room with us on Wednesday, so we're sending people out to the other states to engage with responsible agencies there to get their input, to get their views. Now, after that, we'll now come up with what we call our draft local scorecard, and we'll call the stakeholders back together for workshop 2 in a few weeks from now and say, okay, this is what we have come up with. What do you think? Once that is done, we'll push that upstairs to the World GBC, who brings together the local scorecards from the other pilot countries, and they consolidate them and come up with a single result. That result now comes back down to us, and we'll continue the work next year with more workshops, testing and validating that scorecard.
Okay, and one final question before we go. What long-term impact will the NDC have, do you see the NDC having on Nigeria's beach industry, and how can Nigerians stay informed about the progress of the NDC?
Yes, well, the long-term impact of the project and the NDCs is, let me just say, short-term first of all, the immediate goal we're looking at is we're under the Paris Agreement, where all the countries around the world are supposed to submit their updated NDCs by next year. So short-term vision is that what we're doing, hopefully, will feed into Nigeria's updated NDC that is being submitted in 2025. Longer term, we want to see the outcomes trickle down to our policies at both national and subnational levels to increase the level of ambition, to address any gaps, and to make sure there is alignment. Right now, there's a bit of disalignment between Nigeria's NDC and our policies. Why is that? Because quite a few of the policies predate our NDC. Like our National Building Code is from 2006, but the NDC that we submitted is 2021. The National Building Code therefore it doesn't align with the ambitions of the NDC. Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So many policies. So the long-term vision is we have an NDC that has greater climate ambition, and our national and subnational policies now draw from that and increase their level of ambition and fill in the gaps. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, and that's it for Nigeria Today. And we say thank you to Danjuma Waniko, the President, Green Building Council, Nigeria.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great to be here.
And thank you for being part of the program. Remember, Nigeria Today is every weekday at 7:30 p.m. on NTA News 24. You can check out this episode and others on www.youtube.com/NTA News 24 Hub. Thank you for watching. I am your carrier, Clinton. Goodbye.